All right. Hello and welcome to the Dundas Museum and Archives virtual tour of our current feature exhibit, A Century Ago, Dundas in the 1920s. My name is Austin Strutt. I'm the exhibitions coordinator here at the Dundas Museum and Archives. And behind the camera, we have Anna Patterson, who's our educations coordinator. This exhibit was meant to feature items and stories from Dundas 100 years ago, to use objects from our collection to show what life was like back a century. I'd really like to give this tour like I'd give any other tour and sort of lead you along through and point out things that interest me and that I find very notable. I also want to encourage everybody, just like if it were a regular tour, to please ask questions and put your comments as much as you want into the chat below the video. And we will do our best at the end to do a bit of a question and answer period. And the ones we don't get to that I don't answer aloud, we'll get back to and respond to in the chat later. This exhibit was put up in February, and due to our closures because of COVID-19, we haven't been able to take anybody through to see it in a very long time. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to bring you guys through to take a look at the space. Let me start you off. So just about everything you see in this exhibit, all of the artifacts, come from our collections here at the Dundas Museum and Archives. We've been collecting artifacts from the town since we opened in 1956, and in fact, even a little earlier as an original Dundas Historical Society. The items come from the collections of families who lived in Dundas, people who were related to the town, who lived here, worked here, or felt close to it, and it's their stories connected to the items that really make them so potent and powerful and interesting and worth preserving as part of the history of our community. One of the interesting things about doing an exhibit about the 1920s, looking back 100 years, is there really has never been any time in history before where it's been as easy or fascinating to look back 100 years at what the world was like. The people in the 1920s who looked back 100 years thought of a world of ox carts and horse and carriage, of Regency gentlemen and top hats. It was all very different. All they had were paintings, artifacts, artistic representations of what the world looked like. When we look back 100 years, we have photographs, amazing archival records, film and cinema from the time period, musical recordings so we can hear the music and the voices of the people of the time. It really is an amazing ability that we have nowadays to look back. And we really have to think about people 100 years in the future of what we need to preserve for them so they can understand what our world was like as well. I'll start you off right here with some images from our archival collections. As I said, the 1920s was a period when everything was starting to be preserved very well on film. And these images come from our collection of glass negatives from the town. Some of our glass negatives actually range quite far into the 19th century, but these ones from the 20s give an amazing view of the town as it looked like back then. So this scene is right from about the corner of King and Ogilvie. This is the Carnegie Gallery just poking off to the side, and you can see the Collins Hotel right here. The reason why this image is so amazing and can be blown up so huge is because it was taken on a glass negative. And what that is an actual large pane of glass that was painted with a photosensitive nitrate so that when you take the photo, it is an immensely large negative that comes out from it. The benefit of this is the quality is incredibly enhanced. When you think about going to a movie theater, a whole film on a giant screen would be projected from a little tiny piece of film just about an inch around. So if you have a negative that's this large, you can imagine the detail and quality. Here you can see some of the signs outside the old Buick dealership, which was right next to the Collins. You can even see what is now the Bangkok Spoon was the Dundas Cafe with a large garage next to it. And a good clue to the date, the exact date of this photo, is that the Majestic Theater is open here, which was first built in 1929. And it is not quite advertising sound pictures yet, which would come out in the very next year. Here's another amazing glass negative of one of the old Greitmeyer Dundas and Hamilton buses. So these buses were one of the means by which Dundasians went back and forth between their neighboring community of Hamilton in the days before the public transit was very well established. Before then, there had been a Hamilton and Dundas street railway line, which went along Hat Street and out to the Aberdeen rail yards. But this line had been first started in the 1870s and was very antiquated by that period. The Greitmeyer buses operated out of what's now Sean and Ed's Brewery, which was originally a curling rink and was converted into being a bus depot. These beautiful buses were made in Dundas by the Greitmeyer family, and each one was a little different as they built up their running stock. They ended up with about 7 buses by the end of the 1920s, ferrying passengers back and forth between the two towns. In the case, and it's hard to see, but are a couple of the very small original tickets for those bus lines, which are neat to see. This is some of my favorite part of our collection, are the textiles, dresses, clothing, and accessories that people wore from the time period. All of these are from people who lived in Dundas, and while a lot of them are dress items and not things that people would have worn every day, they are authentic to the history of the town. This example of a dress is gives you a perfect idea of the flapper-style dress of the 1920s. Styles were really changing in the 20s. It was a period when technology and infrastructure and style and design was changing radically. People were interested in having something that looked modern. And the idea of what was feminine and what was traditionally female shape also radically changed in a fascinating way. These long, straight dresses emphasized a more natural, boxy, androgynous shape, and they were absolutely covered with beading, which helped to add to the weight and keep the shape of the dress when you were wearing it. It's incredibly understated compared to the opulent Victorian dresses that people were wearing even just a decade earlier in the 1910s and late 1800s. All this beading, which looks like an incredible amount of work, wouldn't have been fixed on individually. These beads would be strung on a long string, and then that string of beads would have been tacked in a design every once in a while so that they would attach and hold this shape. This dress here in the middle is another one of my absolute favorites. It dates to about 1919, right after the First World War, and is a good example of what women's clothing looked like right at the beginning of the 20s in a bit of a transitional period. It's based off of a naval outfit design, but it's got some really interesting accessories attached to it, including these tassels, and it's a little hard to see, but tiny embroidered bees, little insects on the side. This actually comes from Paris. It was a Paris couturier named, I believe, Elise Poiret, who put it together. I'll take you down further still. Another piece that's really beautiful is this giant embroidered piano shawl. Piano shawls were an accessory which lived on from the Victorian era. They're named after their original usage, which was to cover up a piano or a dressing table, but they would often be worn by women as a wrap when you would go out to cover up your dress when you were going to a party. And usually they were covered with a beautiful amount of embroidery and design and lots of tassels to have this hang off and act sort of like a cape. This beautiful dress is a wedding dress that was worn by Mildred Woods, who married James Murray in 1925 at Knox Presbyterian Church here in Dundas. It's a silk chiffon dress with a lace-lined or lace-hemmed underslip, and it has ecru silk flowers attached to the hips and the shoulder. It's another great example of that really opulent beadwork that they just absolutely loved in the 1920s. These accessories here are also really neat. The Cloche Hat up top is maybe one of the most iconic accessories of the 1920s. It paired perfectly with the short bobbed haircut which came into style at the time. This hat in the center here is a men's straw boater. This would be the summer hat, the complement of the fedora that would be worn by men at the time. And this example was made in Dundas by Grafton's company. These interesting things at the bottom are Boudoir Caps, and they were also a bit of a leftover from the Victorian period, but an interest in saving the bobbed haircut.
Sorry.
Yeah, an interest in protecting that bobbed haircut when you were going to sleep made them a perfect accessory in the 1920s. You see a lot of ladies in movies from the 1920s and 30s, Claudette Colbert and such, wearing these boudoir caps when they go to bed. Some of them are covered with an amazing amount of silk and beadwork too, which you can't imagine would be very comfortable. I'll take you around here. and just let Anna scan over a few of these items. So these are some more personal items and accessories that date to the 1920s. Stockings, chain mesh purses, which were very popular. The influence of Art Deco, which was the newly modern style of design, is really apparent in a lot of these items. They were stark lines, geometric forms, seen as very different from the languid, natural style of Art Nouveau, which had dominated the previous period. There was also a distinct interest in the 1920s to wrap in symbols and artistic motifs from the Far East, and a lot of Japanese and Chinese motifs started to be borrowed and appear in Western clothing. Here in the middle of the exhibit, we put together this little display, which is sort of a mock-up of a room as it might have been furnished in the 1920s. The point of this display is to convey the fact that things didn't change perfectly to Art Deco or look absolutely like they do in the Fred Astaire movies as soon as the 1920s and 30s rolled around. It was a mix of items from various time periods in the last few years that created this domestic look of the 1920s. So some items in here date to the period just before, such as this card table and this old Singer sewing machine. But other items, such as the carpeting, the lamps, the stand-up radio, and even this wallpaper, which has been copied from an original wallpaper book from the 1920s that we have in our collection, all dates to the period of the 1920s. Interestingly, the chair in the back corner was supposedly owned by Sarah Bernhardt, the famous stage actress, who auctioned it off along with a bunch of other belongings she had right at the end of the First World War to raise money for soldiers' relief. These cases on either side give an example of some of the extremes of the style of the time, and these items perfectly exemplify the Art Deco look of the time period. French ivory had a big resurgence in the 1920s, which is these items here. They're not ivory, but plastic, and it's a very brittle plastic and a rudimentary plastic, but some of the first plastic that was widely produced for consumer use. Speaking of technology, we have this case here of all different technological items and bits of machinery that date to the 1920s. Telephones, the Brownie box camera, the first pop-up toaster, a portable gramophone and record player, and a old Underwood typewriter all date to around the 1920s. For Dundas, the technological boom in the 1920s was very important. When when soldiers came back after the war and after the Spanish influenza had passed in 1919, people of Dundas felt that there was a real need to invest in technology and infrastructure in their community. It was in 1920 and 1921 that the streets were finally paved and the sewage system was first put in around King Street, Main Street. They were interested in getting the telephone lines expanded, getting electric light posts put in instead of oil lamps along the main roads. And I believe it was 1924 that houses were first numbered and telephones began to get individual numbers for each of the houses in the community. Of course, back then, a Dundas telephone number was only 2 digits. You would call up 86, 53. It was not even until later that they got the Mayfair telephone number and then eventually the long digit numbers that we have today. Another interest that people of Dundas had in the 1920s was in commemorating their community and redefining it. In the 19th century, Dundas had an idea of itself as an industrial community, but that began to slowly wane over the end of the 19th century, and they were interested now in sort of highlighting the picturesque aspects of their community. That also had to do with a big program of commemorating the First World War and the soldiers involved in fighting. This was when the Soldiers' Memorial was erected in 1921 at Memorial Square, which is King and Sydenham, which has now been moved subsequently out to the Armory. Around here, we have a collection of some goods that might appear in a grocery store in the 1920s. Some of these items actually come from P&R Lang's, which was a grocery store that began in the 1860s and extended all the way through to the 1950s in Dundas. Mountain View Dairy, one of the many dairies in town, started out in the 1920s. Ovaltine, Laura Secord candies. These are things that are still around today, but were first gaining traction around the 1920s and 1910s. The milk bottle at the far left side there is a cream top milk bottle, and it was before the pasteurization prevented the cream and milk from separating. The little spoon that's in it would allow you to scoop out the cream or to block the milk at the bottom and just pour out the cream if you wanted to. This cigar box here is a box of Tuckett's Preferred from the 1920s. Tuckett's was a Hamilton brand of cigars named after a prominent businessman and a former mayor who started the business. All things that might appear in a grocery store or a corner store. And here is one of my absolute favorite images from our archives of a Dundas Corner Store from the 1920s. So this building is actually still there. It's at the corner of King and Church Street. And by the mid-1920s, this is about 1926, it was Fowley's Bakery and the Cozy Corner Lunch upstairs. The amazing quality of this image allows you to take a really close look at all the items that are being advertised and sold: Coca-Cola, Players, cigarettes, ice cream. And what's very interesting is right beside is Bolt's Imperial Aerated Waters, which was actually a Dundas soda company. They made soda water and created their own soft drinks, including Smile, which was an orange-flavored soft drink. You can see, too, that they've crammed a cleaning and pressing shop and a sidewalk gas station into the same place. Smile soda wasn't sold for very long in Dundas. The business only operated into the 1930s. We actually have an example of one of the original Smile soda bottles here from our collection. Some of the objects around here have an interesting place in the kitchen and in the home. This is another of my favorite pieces. So it's a circa late 1910s, early 1920s ice box. So this is the refrigerator of the 1920s. Before electricity, a large block of ice would be placed in the top of the ice box, and that would serve to keep the rest of the items being stored below it chilled. Back in the 1920s, just as it had been going back to the very earliest days of Dundas, ice was harvested from the old Desjardins Canal, and it was cut out with large saws at this time by the Cowper family, who ran an ice business in town, and sold that ice along with coal from their business at the corner of King and Sydenham, now where the TD Bank is. The item to the side there that Anna's panning to is a Fireless Cooker. So this is a sort of stove, and it represents an interesting transitional point in kitchen appliances because it used hot water rather than wood or electricity to boil your food. It was at a time when wood-burning stoves were starting to be considered dirty and antiquated and dangerous, but before houses were universally electrified. Some more objects around here relate to child life in the 1920s. These are all toys that are fairly iconic of the period. The teddy bear, a Boy's Own annual, a toy sewing machine, and a Cupid doll. Cupid dolls were often won as prizes, and this one, unfortunately, is missing its outfit that it would have come with. So the photographs are a really great resource for the time period, as well as recollections that people wrote down of what life was like. But one of my favorite things to look at to really get an understanding of what the layout of the community was like are old maps. And this is a really fascinating example of a map of Dundas. It's actually 3 portions of a map that have been sewn together, but it's part of the old fire insurance plans of Dundas, dating around 1924. What's interesting about the fire insurance plans from the time period is they were meant to be a reference for the actual ways that the buildings were constructed. And the color coding allows you to know what the building was made out of. Red meaning brick, yellow meaning wood and blue being stone. It's interesting to see Dundas's King Street strip has changed a lot, but compared to a lot of towns, it's been really remarkably preserved. And a lot of buildings like the Collins, places like Poconi's, the Carnegie Library, which is now the Carnegie Gallery, Post Office, Melbourne Central Hotel, they're all very recognizable on this map. It comes to us courtesy of Western Archives. As I said, the Soldiers' Memorial was part of what people were very interested in commemorating in the early 1920s. Many soldiers in Dundas who had been part of the old 77th Regiment joined up and found themselves spread out and mixed up into different parts of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, where they fought at places like Ypres, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the Somme. And many Dundas soldiers lost their lives in service during the First World War, including some from some of the most prominent or at least families in town, such as the Knowles and the Bertram families. They were obviously very interested in funding commemorative artworks and projects, and this, the building of the Soldiers' Memorial, was one of the first major ones of the 1920s. Many churches and other places around town would also set up those things and then throughout the decade. So I suppose I'll take some questions now, if there are any in there, Anna. I'll do my best.
I don't think we've actually had any questions yet, but if you do have a question, feel free to comment right now. We'll take any questions you have, or let us know which is your favorite artifact that you've seen here today. If there's one you want to focus on, we can go back and do a little close-up of it. Just let us know in the comments, and give us a little like or a heart if you enjoyed the tour today. And let us know if there's something else you'd like to see in the museum that we can do a tour of for you while we're in the process of reopening.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly, Anna.
Not seeing any questions right now. Super happy to see everybody watching from Dundas, Barrie, Guelph. We have people from all over Ontario watching right now.
Well, that's fantastic to see.
Oh, we do have a question here, Austin.
All right.
What is your favorite artifact in the show?
Okay, geez. Well, that little Smile soda bottle is something that I really love. But I'll take Anna over here again, and I'll point out one of my very favorites is this little mesh purse, this orange and white one right there. So it's made out of a chain link mesh. It's a little clutch purse, and there's actually little pieces of enamel, colored enamel, that have been fixed on and locked onto the chain mesh. These purses, which almost mimic the very vertical weighted style of the dresses at the time period, were incredibly popular.
Have a note that you weren't able to hear me talking because we do have Austin mic'd right now. So in case you couldn't hear me, let us know what your favorite artifact is. Let us know if you have any questions, if there's something you want us to go back to. The question that Austin just answered was, what is his favorite artifact in the collection? So we have one question here. My grandfather left me an Underwood typewriter. Can you show it again? So can we go back to the Underwood typewriter?
Oh yeah, certainly. So we just got a request to take a look at the Underwood typewriter again. Yeah, sure. Express some interest in is taking a look into the icebox or the stove. I'd be happy to, though it's not incredibly exciting. Essentially what you just have here, and there's some of the artifact worksheets inside that we use to track the items, but it is a metal box which would be, cooled down by the cold water and ice that's left in the top. What I love most is the cabinetry that is attached to these items. They were really made to look like furniture pieces, not just appliances that were completely utilitarian. The food would go in this bottom compartment there. The stove, again, so the food would be placed into these wells, whereas a boiling water would be filled throughout the rest of the, inside this casing, and it would be that boiling water, once you closed it and insulated it, that would theoretically cook the food. What do we know about the sewing machine? Actually, so there's a beautiful example of a Singer sewing machine, which dates to just before the 1920s, and it's right here. So this sewing machine was purchased actually at the Hamilton Sewing Machine Company as a gift for, I'm going to butcher the family's name, but Carmela Serralio, and as a wedding gift when she emigrated here from Italy around 1917. What's interesting is the Egyptian motifs that are present, the little sphinxes and things, sort of anticipate the revival of Egyptian art and style, which became very popular in the 1920s following the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter. Suddenly little sphinxes and scarabs and ankhs began appearing all over people's decoration and jewelry and motifs at the time. Oh, sure thing. I'll take you around too. Someone else is interested in seeing a close-up of the glass negative image of King Street. I can just stare at these glass negatives for ages. So Craven's Furniture Store, which was a long-standing furniture store, can be seen next to the Majestic Theater. The Majestic Theater is now the Horn of Plenty. The top of the Central Hotel can just be seen in the back there. And as you move up the street, you pass another car garage and the Dundas Cafe, which is now the Bangkok Spoon. The Collins Hotel is very prominent, and interestingly, in front of it is a hanging net. This net, which almost looks like some kind of anti-aircraft cover, had vines and things that would grow in it, so that it would look very lush and be a kind of canopy for people in the summertime. But it often obscures the Collins in old photographs. It's also neat to see the air pumps and gas pumps, which were installed right into the sidewalk by the end of the 1920s. Above the image, we actually have a series of Dundas license plates for each of the year, or at least Ontario license plates for each of the years of the 1920s. License plates back then changed yearly, and so dating photographs it can be very helpful looking at license plates in order to date photographs by seeing what's their earliest possible time period based on the style of license plate visible. I'll take you in here. This is a really neat image of an early Dundas automobile which was working through the 1920s. This was Mr. D.E. Knowles's hearse and ambulance, which would have serviced the community throughout that time period. Yes. So these images are now available online through our collective access, our newly active collective access site, which can be accessed at I guess it's collective access .Dundas Museum. We'll add a link to that in our comment section because I don't know it off by heart. But digitizing these items so that people can take a look at them, have access to them, and so that they can particularly be accessible to people at times like today when you're not able to visit the museum is particularly important to us. So.
Sorry, the question was, what schools would they have had then?
Oh, yes. So there were a lot of the schools that we recognize or remember were here around in Dundas at the time. Certainly a Central School, St. Augustine's, and I believe the high school, some of the high schools in town, I'll have to check back to get a complete list, but there was an interest in expanding them, though I'm blanking on the exact years or whether they're late 20s or early 30s. But there was a big interest in expanding high school infrastructure at the time and schooling infrastructure diversifying the number of schools that were available. And it was in the 1920s and 30s that we got a big boom of these schools, which is now slowly beginning to shrink. But it's always interesting that by the mid-century, there were about 6 or 7 different schools of different levels operating in Dundas that serviced Dundas children.
Are most items private donations?
Yes. So most items are private donations from people who have over the years preserved their items and brought them in to us at the museum. When somebody brings an item in to the museum, it goes to our committee, which is the people who work here, to look at the significance of the item and whether we want to keep it. And usually the criteria is, does it help tell some story of not only the time period in which it comes from, but the character of the town itself. And what's interesting is, sometimes people can bring in very fancy items or beautiful items, but they don't have much to relate to Dundas. But other times, somebody can bring in something very simple, a humble little artifact, but because it has a potent story that attaches to it, that's what makes it so meaningful to us. And so everybody really has a chance to contribute to that preserved history of our town by bringing in the stories of themselves and their family members and their lives in Dundas, along with those items that we have. These items range from being recent acquisitions, such as Mrs. Wood's dress, or Miss Wood's dress, which I had mentioned, which only came in at the end of last year, and to items which have been in our collection since the museum very first opened in the 1950s. As I said, almost everything in this room comes from our private collection, which is stored downstairs in the vault, which our curator and general manager, Kevin, toured in a previous Facebook Live video. But a few items also come on loan from people in town who are collectors and friends of the museum who have items that they know would contribute. And this relationship with the community is something that we really love to foster by having people bring in their items, even if you're not ready to give it to us permanently, to offer it for a little while on a loan.
Fantastic, Austin. Thank you so much. I just want to encourage everybody to take a look at all of our online resources as well. We have the recording of the previous live stream that Austin mentioned with our curator and general manager of our storage facilities. You can also check out our Discover Your Historical Dundas website if any of the sites are of interest to you. Lots of talk on here about the schools, the Central Public School and Dundas District High School. You can check on our website for more information about those. And if we haven't answered your question here today, don't worry, we're going to be checking in on the comments here, so feel free to keep leaving your questions and we will go through over the next little while and answer any of the questions that you might have. So I will pass it back to Austin, but on behalf of myself, I would like to say thank you all so much for visiting us virtually today at the museum.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone who's been watching and leaving comments and questions. Please continue and leave comments. We'd love to see a conversation going, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions and queries that people have over the next little while. These virtual tours are something that we hope to keep doing here at the museum for the next while, so please make sure that you tell your friends about it and join us again for the next one. Thank you so much.